Welcome to Life Stories, where we share moments that inspire, challenge, and leave a lasting impact. In today's story, a group of bikers walks into a bar, looking for trouble, and finds themselves face to face with an elderly man sitting quietly in the corner. Little do they know, this man's past holds a truth that will silence the room and transform their lives. It's a tale of humility, respect, and the unseen battles others have fought. Don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories and join us as we dive into today's unforgettable encounter. It was a Friday night like any other at Joe's Bar and Grill, just outside Austin, Texas. The place hummed with the usual noise of laughter, clinking glasses, and the jukebox playing an old rock anthem from decades past. Regulars gathered around the long wooden bar, swapping stories about their week. Conversations overlapped, and the warm glow of neon beer signs added to the bar's familiar atmosphere. In the far corner, barely touched by the overhead light, sat an elderly man nursing a glass of whiskey. His posture was upright, his movements steady, and his demeanor quiet, almost meditative. The olive-green military cap on his head bore faded insignia, its frayed edges hinting at years of wear. Despite its condition, the hat carried an air of quiet dignity, much like the man who wore it. He was Jack Davis. Locals knew him as Colonel Davis, though he rarely spoke of his past. He was a regular at Joe's, always sitting in the same corner, always with the same drink. Some new snippets of his story: Vietnam, Desert Storm, heroics whispered about but never confirmed. Most respected his space, letting him enjoy his evenings in peace. The night's tranquility was interrupted when the bar door swung open, letting in a burst of cool air and a gang of 6 bikers, clad in black leather jackets adorned with patches and bold slogans. They were loud and carried the kind of confidence that bordered on arrogance. They were regulars too, though their visits were sporadic and their antics unpredictable. The leader, a towering man named Brick, had a laugh that could shake the walls. Brick slapped the bar and ordered a round of beers, his voice carrying over the ambient noise. His crew filled the room with their presence, drawing nervous glances from the regulars. Most of the patrons quickly looked away, knowing better than to catch their attention. It didn't take long for the bikers to notice Colonel Davis in the corner. One of them, a wiry man with a sly grin, nudged his companion. "Hey, check it out. Grandpa's out past his bedtime." The others chuckled, their voices rising above the hum of the bar. Brick glanced over, his eyes narrowing with curiosity. "Bet he doesn't even remember what year it is," another chimed in, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. Colonel Davis didn't react. He lifted his glass, took a slow sip, and set it back down with deliberate care. His silence only seemed to fuel their antics. Brick smirked and turned to his crew. "Maybe he's one of those war vets," he said mockingly. "What do you think, boys? Should we go pay our respects?" Frank, the bartender, froze mid-motion, his hand gripping the edge of the counter. He was a gruff man with a no-nonsense attitude, someone who had seen his fair share of bar fights and knew when trouble was brewing. He shot a warning glance at Brick and his crew. "Leave him alone," Frank said, his voice firm. "He's not bothering anybody." But the bikers weren't in the mood to listen. Brick chuckled and shrugged. "Just having a little fun, Frank. No harm in that, right?" Frank's jaw tightened, but he didn't push further. He knew when to intervene and when to let things play out. For now, he watched, his gaze flicking between the bikers and Colonel Davis. The bikers moved toward the corner, their footsteps heavy and deliberate. Conversations tapered off, the bar growing quieter as the tension in the room thickened. Most patrons avoided looking directly at the unfolding scene, but their unease was palpable. Brick stopped a few feet from Colonel Davis's table, towering over the seated figure. "Hey there, Pops," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "That's a nice hat you've got. Military, huh? See some action back in the day?" Colonel Davis didn't look up. Instead, he adjusted the brim of his cap and took another sip of his whiskey. His silence seemed unshakable. An immovable force against Brick's bluster. "What's the matter?" Brick pressed. "Louder this time. Cat got your tongue. Or are you just too old to hear me?" The other bikers chuckled nervously, sensing that Brick was pushing the limits. Finally, Colonel Davis set his glass down and looked up. His calm, piercing gaze meeting Brick's. His voice, low and steady, cut through the noise like a knife. "Do you boys need something?" he asked. Brick chuckled again, but there was a flicker of discomfort in his eyes. "Yeah. We need you to lighten up. You're killing the vibe in here, sitting all quiet like that." Colonel Davis leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable. "I'm just enjoying my drink," he said evenly. "You should try doing the same." For a moment, it seemed like Brick might back off, but his pride wouldn't let him. He snatched the cap off Colonel Davis's head, holding it up like a trophy. "Why don't you tell us what makes you so special?" "Her," he taunted. A murmur ran through the bar. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and Frank stiffened behind the counter. The tension was electric, and everyone in the room knew something was about to happen. Colonel Davis stood up slowly, his movements deliberate. Without the cap, the deep lines on his face seemed even more pronounced, each one a testament to time and hardship. "That's not yours," he said, his voice calm but edged with steel. "Now hand it back." The room seemed to hold its collective breath, waiting for what would come next. The tension in Joe's bar and grill was palpable. The room had gone silent except for the faint hum of the jukebox, its melody now an afterthought to the unfolding confrontation. Brick, the biker leader, stood holding Colonel Davis's military cap, waving it in the air with a grin that teetered between amusement and defiance. His crew stood behind him, their earlier laughter now replaced by uncertain glances. "Or what, old man?" Brick sneered, dangling the cap mockingly. "You gonna call your bingo buddies to back you up?" Colonel Davis didn't flinch. He stood tall, his calm presence somehow radiating authority. His gaze locked on Brick's, and for a brief moment, the towering biker faltered, though he quickly masked it with a forced chuckle. It was Frank, the bartender, who finally broke the silence. "Brick," he said, his voice sharp and commanding. "Give it back. Now." Brick turned toward Frank, his grin slipping slightly. "Relax, Frank. We're just having a little fun. The old man can take a joke." Frank slammed a glass down on the counter, the sound echoing through the room. "This isn't a joke," he snapped. "You don't know who you're messing with." Brick hesitated, his bravado flickering. "What are you talking about?" he asked, though his voice lacked the confidence it had moments ago. Frank stepped out from behind the bar, his boots thudding heavily against the wooden floor. He crossed the room with deliberate steps, his gaze fixed on Brick. The bikers shifted uneasily as Frank approached, his presence almost as commanding as Colonel Davis's. "You really don't know, do you?" Frank said, stopping just a few feet away. He pointed at the cap still in Brick's hand. "That's not just some old man's hat. That belongs to Colonel Jack Iron Davis. Vietnam. Desert Storm. One of the most decorated war heroes this country has ever known." The air seemed to thicken as Frank's words settled over the room. The patrons exchanged wide-eyed glances, their previous unease now mingled with awe. Even the jukebox seemed to quiet, as if paying respect to the man in the corner. Brick blinked, his grin vanishing completely. "You're kidding," he said, though his voice wavered. Frank folded his arms, his expression unyielding. "I'm not. I served under him. Gulf War. 1991. If it weren't for him, I wouldn't be standing here. He saved my life, and the lives of a dozen others, during a firefight we shouldn't have survived." The bikers exchanged nervous glances, their earlier confidence crumbling. The youngest of the crew, who had been laughing the loudest earlier, now looked down at his boots, avoiding everyone's gaze. Brick opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. He looked back at Colonel Davis, who stood silently, his piercing eyes fixed on the man holding his cap. The colonel didn't need to say anything, his presence spoke volumes. Frank took a step closer, his voice lowering but losing none of its intensity. "This man," he said, gesturing to Davis, "has seen more, done more, and sacrificed more than you can imagine. And you're standing here, mocking him, like you've got a fraction of the strength it takes to walk in his boots." Brick's hand trembled slightly, the cap now hanging limply in his grip. "I didn't know," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "You shouldn't have to know," Colonel Davis finally said, his voice calm but firm. "Respect isn't something you give because of someone's title or history. It's something you give because it's the right thing to do." The room was utterly still. Even the patrons who had tried to stay out of it were now fully invested, their expressions a mix of admiration and guilt. The younger bikers shuffled their feet, their bravado completely gone. Brick lowered his gaze, the weight of the moment finally breaking through his pride. Slowly, he extended the cap toward Colonel Davis. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice strained but sincere. "I didn't mean any disrespect." Colonel Davis took the cap, his movements slow and deliberate. He adjusted the brim before placing it back on his head, then looked at Brick with a steady gaze. "Apology accepted," he said. "But remember this moment. Respect is free, but the lack of it can cost you more than you realize." Brick nodded, his shoulders slumping as he stepped back. The rest of the bikers followed suit, their earlier swagger replaced by quiet reflection. Frank stepped beside Colonel Davis, clapping him gently on the shoulder. "You didn't need me to step in," he said with a small smile. "But I'm glad I did." Colonel Davis gave a faint nod, his face unreadable but his eyes carrying the weight of a lifetime's worth of lessons. "Sometimes people need more than words to understand," he replied. As the tension in the room began to dissipate, the patrons started to murmur, their conversations tinged with newfound respect. The bikers returned to their table, subdued and thoughtful, while Colonel Davis sat back down, lifting his glass to his lips as if nothing had happened. The air inside Joe's bar and grill had shifted. What began as a tense confrontation had dissolved into something quieter, more reflective. Conversations were hushed, the bar's usual boisterous energy replaced by an undercurrent of reverence. Colonel Jack Davis sat back in his corner, his whiskey glass in hand, the brim of his olive-green cap now adjusted with care. He looked at peace, but the weight of his words still hung heavily over the room. At the bikers' table, Brick and his crew were unusually subdued. Their earlier rowdiness had been replaced with an uncomfortable silence. Brick sat with his elbows on the table, staring at his beer, his jaw tight as if wrestling with unspoken thoughts. His crew exchanged glances, none of them quite sure what to say. The youngest, who had laughed the loudest earlier, finally broke the silence with a muttered, "We really messed up." Brick exhaled sharply, nodding. "Yeah," he said, his voice low. "We did." The room turned its attention back to Colonel Davis when he unexpectedly stood. He moved with deliberate calm, setting his glass down before addressing the room. "You boys," he said, his voice carrying across the bar, "think strength is about how loud you are, how much noise you make. But let me tell you something, real strength is quiet. It's in what you stand for, not what you tear down." Brick raised his eyes to meet the colonel's, his earlier bravado gone. "You're right," he admitted. "I thought I was being tough, but I was just being a fool." Colonel Davis nodded slowly. "Recognizing that is a good start," he said. "But the real challenge is what you do next." The entire bar seemed to hold its breath as the colonel continued. "I've carried men out of burning vehicles. I've held brothers while they took their last breaths. I've fought for freedoms most people don't even think about. And I've done it alongside men who understood what respect and honor truly mean. The kind of men who lift others up instead of tearing them down. Brick swallowed hard. Visibly humbled. I didn't mean any disrespect, he said again. His voice quieter now. I didn't think. That's the problem. Colonel Davis replied. Most people don't think. But every action, every word, it matters. You don't know the battles people are fighting, the scars they carry, or the weight they bear. The younger bikers nodded. Their expressions a mix of shame and newfound understanding. The room felt heavier with the colonel's words. Their truth undeniable. After a pause, Colonel Davis turned to Frank behind the bar. Frank, he said, his voice softening. Another round for everyone here. On me. The room collectively exhaled. The tension easing as smiles began to return to faces. Frank nodded and started pouring drinks. His movements more deliberate than usual, as though acknowledging the gravity of the moment. As Frank worked, the colonel addressed Brick and his crew one last time. You've got a choice, he said. You can keep being the men you were when you walked in here. Or you can be better. The world's already got enough noise and ego. What it needs is men who know how to show respect, even when they don't think it's deserved. Brick stood, extending his hand toward the colonel. Thank you, he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. For your service. And for putting us in our place. Colonel Davis clasped Brick's hand firmly, his grip strong despite his years. It's not about putting you in your place, he said. It's about reminding you of the man you could be. The bikers returned to their table. Visibly changed. They murmured quietly among themselves. Their earlier antics replaced by thoughtful conversation. Across the room, the patrons had resumed their own discussions, but now with a sense of shared respect for the man who had just spoken. As the evening wore on, Colonel Davis finished his whiskey and stood to leave. The bar fell quiet as he adjusted his cap and made his way to the door. Just before stepping outside, he turned back, his gaze sweeping over the room. Respect doesn't cost you anything, he said, his voice steady but kind. But it's worth everything. With that, he walked out into the cool Texas night, leaving the room in thoughtful silence. Brick and his crew sat for a while longer, the weight of the evening settling over them. Finally, Brick spoke, his voice quiet but resolute. We've got some work to do, he said. His crew nodded in agreement. A small but meaningful step toward change. Back at the bar, Frank picked up the colonel's empty glass, holding it for a moment before placing it in the sink. That's the kind of man, he said softly, who reminds you what honor really looks like. The night at Joe's Bar and Grill continued. But it wasn't the same. Colonel Davis had left an indelible mark. Not just on the bikers, but on everyone who witnessed his quiet strength. It was a story they would all carry with them, a reminder of the power of respect and the quiet courage it takes to live by it. As Colonel Davis stepped out into the cool Texas night, the bar behind him seemed quieter, more reflective. His words and actions had left an undeniable mark on everyone present. From the humbled bikers to the regular patrons. Respect, he had reminded them, costs nothing but holds immense value, a lesson that would linger long after he'd gone. Inside, conversations resumed in softer tones, and the bikers sat deep in thought, their earlier bravado replaced by quiet determination to be better men. Frank, the bartender, wiped down the counter, his expression a mix of pride and gratitude for the man who had once saved his life and now inspired a room to change. Stories like this remind us of the quiet power of integrity and respect. Subscribe to Life Stories for more tales that inspire reflection, change, and a deeper understanding of humanity.